Okay, so research methods. I won't be offended if you leave now because you realize you're in the wrong class. So how many of you ever, volunteered to do research before? Good. I know you have. So can you tell me like who you volunteered for? Uh-huh. Yeah. What's the project?
It's doing technology studies in Scotland and Belgium.
Mhm.
And then the biomonitoring, but monthly funding. Like there's actually like what there's VOC, things like that.
Right. And what do you do?
Think the stuff around like grandkids or I go to Brazil.
Uh-huh.
To collect different samples and then bring them back here and then process them and they ship them off.
I hope they don't spill in the car.
Yeah, that's a problem.
Oh, that's good. It's good to hear. Yeah. And you, uh-huh. Right. Mhm. And what do you do?
I actually started for lab where kind of leading for
Mhm. Right. And you did something this summer. Yeah. And you want to tell the exciting things that you did this summer?
I'm actually still in the research lab for and it was like super interesting because at first we worked it was collecting like fast sweets actually, is that what it was called? For different counties in the Central Valley. And then now we're more working on document collection. We're actually all of California with all the different counties in California. And we kind of figure out like what adds up, what goes with, it's like we follow the standard and we try to see like which of the counties actually do follow that standard and we compare it and how we're comparing like outcomes and like health in those counties and seeing like if like actually following that standard will affect the outcomes.
And the first study was the farm workers study. So it was 1,500 farm workers we had interviewed for the in California. And what we did is we wanted to sort of identify where they live, but you don't want to ask their address because a lot of them are undocumented. So what you do is you ask for the cross streets, and then someone has to go and figure out where all these cross streets are throughout the region. So you learned a lot about Google Maps and how to go through and figure out. Yeah, that's good. Rudy, when you were an undergraduate, did you volunteer for research?
Really wanted to do maybe towards the end of my fourth year. That's when I started diving into more of a little bit of like literature first.
Right.
So looking at that still.
And what do you do now?
I see a lot of bigger stuff. So this is well, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a teaching student. I work with Professor Brown, he's my advisor. I'm towards the end of the program, so I do a lot of substitute research and public research, so this is on pain management, the cannabis, opioids, and over the counter government. It's really fun.
Yeah. Will you be passing out free samples later on so that we can sort of do it in
Right.
now? It could be like could be part of the research process that we go through. Anyone else? So this class is about research methods. Right? So just a couple of housekeeping things. So even though it's not listed yet, Rudy is the TA for the class. And he'll be announcing when his office hours and things like that are coming up. My office hours is that I'm on campus on Tuesday and Thursdays for certain. So if you want to meet in person, I can, but I think most people tend to like to meet on Zoom. So we can I'll either meet I'll just have an open session on Thursdays from 12 to 1, or if you want to meet with me, just let me know and we'll set the time to meet. Okay, today I thought we'd sort of just review kind of what the course is in terms of, and specifically how the grading is going to go. And then talk a little bit about research and probably let you go early. So first, there's a book. This is the book. There's different versions of the book. You can get it off of, you can get if you go on Amazon, you can get it as a rental book. It's nice, but it's short. It also means it's kind of dense. So I'll try and fairly follow the book as we go through. I mean, I'm not going to cover everything that's in here because I'm going to assume that you can read. But I will go through and kind of try to make the topics, follow along the topics. And if you look at the syllabus then has what chapter basically we're going to, is relevant to that. A lot of what we do though is going to give you research articles to read. And this is a great classroom for it because, you can't hide in the back of the classroom. So I'm going to give you a research article to read. And so a lot of what we're going to do is basically go through and just read research articles because that turns out to be really important to know how to read how a research article is structured and how you go about reading it. So starting next week, next Tuesday, we're going to essentially talk about what's a research article and how's it, kind of just point by point, how you go through and do it. But the other thing is that research methods is kind of about how you think critically about research, and also the ethics of research. So we're going to go through quite a bit in terms of the, some of the ethical problems that arise with the research. Good news is there's a lot of great movies about ethical problems in research. So I think Oppenheimer, I haven't seen it yet, but I think Oppenheimer gets into one of the key critical methods of research, which is, should you develop something which can destroy the world? We'll talk about AI, because I love AI. It's a great research methods topic in terms of, will AI destroy the world? And should we just let it do it? So we'll go through topics like that when we talk about kind of the ethics of research. But then a lot of what we do is also we'll just talk about kind of the process of how you do research. Because first off, we're in a research university. A research university kind of has special meanings. So for example, my job is like if I was teaching at Cal State Fresno, my job at Cal State Fresno would be I would teach 4 classes each semester. And then in the summertime, I might do some research in the summertime. Usually you'd have to do like maybe 1 research paper every couple of years. In a UC, we teach 3 classes a year. And so, our assumption is that we're going to do 40% teaching, and that teaching means also, graduate students, 40% research, and then 20% kind of service things. So really the majority of my work at a research university is doing research or working with graduate students who are doing research. And then the teaching part is, of course, important, but it's not the focus of a research university, really. But it also means that what it's supposed to do for you then is that you're supposed to be able to be taught by people who know more about, who are more actively involved in research. Not saying that people at Cal State aren't good researchers, just that that's what the UC is about as a research university. And so it means that when you get out, is that what you're should be able to do is essentially do research. Is one of the first jobs you're likely to get, at least you're likely to be interviewed to get, is to some place where they're going to want you to do things like literature reviews and write up what you find and be able to summarize it into a document that's easily readable. So, the type of things that functionally that most of you are going to end up doing when you get out of here, in terms of what your career job is going to be something that deals with some type of research skills. So I would say, we'll go through the class. Also is that, this could be a year-long class easily in research methods. I don't think that many of you would want to take a year-long class in research methods, but it is. There's enough to cover in it. So I guess what I would say is that if you're not involved in research, is to try and get involved in research. Go to the faculty and ask if they can, Okay, and we'll meet here every Tuesday and Thursday. The other thing is that I'll record the lectures. So I'm Zoom recording it right now. I'm not And then what I'll do is I'll take the recordings, and I'll put them on YouTube. So that it means that if you want to go back later on and sort of see kind of what it is that we, want to review what we did, it will be on a YouTube channel, and I'll give the link to it and everything. It also means that if you can't make the class for some reason, that's the way to make it up, is just to go through and to look on YouTube and watch it there. It won't pick up things like it won't pick up comments or conversations that you make. So it's not really that good for that. And I'm also not going to bother switching around between different screens when I switch around. So it will be kind of just not exactly what we're doing in lecture, but it'll be pretty close. All right, so grading. So on the syllabus is online. Here's the syllabus. So you can see in the syllabus, basically, there's going to be 2 midterms and then 5 assignments. And each midterm is worth 100 points, and the assignments are worth 25 points, and I'll drop one at the lowest assignment. So it means that there's 100 points for the midterm, 100 points for the second midterm, and 100 points for the assignments, so 300 points in total. In terms of the way it's going to grade, well, I'm going to be laborious about this because I've realized over time is that different professors have different ways that they grade. And so I want to be very, kind of just make it transparent how I grade. So basically your midterms are worth about 2/3 of your grade, and the assignments is worth about 1/3 of your grade. So let's say we had these students here, and that these were the scores on the midterm. Midterm 1, midterm 2 of 100 points. And then these are what they got for the assignments. So that's their total for their assignments. So that this is their total points at the end of it. Okay, follow me? Because that's what I do. I just keep track of the points as you go through. So it kind of means that for the midterms, I'll give you a letter grade, but that's not really the way I record it. The way I record it is points. So if you're like a point below a higher grade, that means that just if you do better on the assignments or the finals, that then will push you up, and vice versa. If you're right above the lower grade, it means that you need to make sure not to drop down the next time. So let's say you have this. Well, there is a grading scale that the university kind of uses that's in the syllabus. So this is the grading scale that's officially on the scale, where basically 100 or 94 to 97 is an A, 97 to 100 is an A plus, etc. And so what if you translate that to 300 points, then this is the point total. So what some people do is that some people, professors, when they grade, is that they basically just grade to kind of fit this grading scale, right? The other way to do it is that you just grade based upon just give whatever points that people get, but then adjust the grading scale as we go through. So for example, if we were to use that grading scale for the group I just showed you, is that then this would be what their scores would be. The high score would be a B minus, and the low score would be an F. In fact, there'd be a couple different Fs. And it's because, that's a very tight grading scale, right? So let's say if that was what it looked like, then then one of the questions to ask is, well, why is it that people got such low scores on the tests? So one is that, students in class didn't study, let's say. That just turns out that that's a class of students that just didn't study very much. In my experience, that never happens. Is that, a lot of different universities, and I've never had a class where I thought, oh, people just weren't trying in this class. That's one possibility. Second possibility is I did a crap job. That's a possibility. I had a class with a professor who he did this. He only wrote on the board, and he would get in there, and it was a math class. And he would start writing on one side, and he would just write equations the entire time. And probably about half the class, so we just sit there and watch him just write these equations on the board, and he'd be talking at the board, so you couldn't really hear him. And he finally got in. Happened about half the classes were with about 10 minutes left, you get over to that side of the board and you go, oh, I made a mistake. And then you go back and try to figure out. And so the class would just end and he'd be still trying to figure out where he made the mistake. That's not a good class. So that's a possibility, is that professors, can do a bad job in the class. And so students really shouldn't be punished just because the professor does a bad job in the class. Another one, test was hard. That's a possibility, and that happens a lot. My tests tend to have lower averages, because I tend to, when I write a test, what I try to do is I try to make the average about 60 points out of 100, because I want to give enough range for people who really do well to show that they can really do well, as opposed to getting a test where your average is going to be 90, in which case people can't really show that they can do that well. Possibility, not enough time, other types of things occur. So, the options then that I face is that as professors to say, well, do I fail everyone or give everyone really, really bad grades? Or do you grade on a curve? And so typically we grade on a curve. It's like how many classes, like in most of your classes, do people grade on a curve? Or do people just give grade based upon the scale? Show me curve, use the scale. It depends. So what I do is I'll grade it on a curve. So it means that if you all ace everything, then you all get A pluses, and I'll just use the scale that's there. But if the average in the class is lower than I think is sort of what should be, then what I'll do is I'll grade, essentially use a curve so that you moves up the class average. And the way it does is that classes, if you have a big class, usually if you look at the distribution of grades, it turns out to be sometimes a bell-shaped curve, but oftentimes it's a bimodal curve, and that you'll have a whole bunch of people at C's and you have a whole bunch of people at B pluses in that area. So that's typically what the class looks like. So what I do is I basically just sort of pin on where and also you can have very long tails. So some people will just don't show up a class or just come and take the test and get like 5 points out of 100 on the test. So you have a very long tail on one side. So what I do is I set the average grade at probably a B, either a B minus or a B or B plus, depending upon the class. Research methods, I tend to set a little bit higher because I know that this is, the upper division class and that this is a hard class. So I tend to go a little bit higher. And then what I do is I kind of look at the top mark, and then that becomes kind of the A plus. And then I look at the bottom marks, and that sort of tells me, kind of in general where the D or the Fs are going to be. And then I sort of just scale it from there. So it means that if I were to take these grades and scale them, rather than having these types of scores, it would be like this. The top person would get an A plus, the bottom one would get, something like a D, and then I just scale it from there on. Okay. So come back. So what it means is that it's taking this type of distribution and essentially just making it that type of distribution. So rather than being centered on D and F, like it would be if I use the university's grading scale, it gets centered on a B, and then I just use that one. Okay. So is there questions about that? All right. So what it means is basically is that as we go through and grade, is that I'll drop your lowest assignment score. So if you end up having you can't make an assignment for some reason or whatever, is I'll just take the lowest one and drop it. If you nail all the assignments, that I still drop one of them. So and then I'll just take your total points and add them together, and that's how we figure out your grade at the end of the semester. I'll tell you after the end of the first midterm, kind of in general, how you're doing. And then by the time we get to the last midterm, a lot of people want to know what their grade is going to the final. It's going to be a lot dependent upon what your midterm score was, because that's the main thing that people are going to have done by that point. Good. Okay. So points matter. At the letter grades of the midterm, I won't record those things. I'll tell you, I'll grade on the curve unless you all ace everything. And then and the other thing is that, if you all do well, then I really do bump up all the grades. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to make a competitive situation, especially in research methods. It should be a cooperative environment. So therefore, I really want to encourage you to work together and that to study together, and that, when you do assignments, I'm fine if you want to get together and talk about your assignments together. So, I think it definitely is something for which you'll learn a lot more if you explain it to someone than if you just try and do it by yourself. Final thing, ignore any grades you see on CAT course. So what CAT course does, that CAT course uses this type of system, that I just showed you. CAT course also gives you, how we now have to report whether people actually show up and do something in class. And then what happens that CAT course counts that as an assignment and gives you an A+ on it. And so you may look in after 2 weeks and see that you got an A+ in the course. And it's just because you were here, and CAT course treats attendance as an assignment and gives you a grade for it. I try to go through and basically get it so CAT course doesn't do that, but sometimes it screws up. And so it just means ignore the grade that's formally on CAT course as we go through. Okay, any questions? Okay, so research. First realize that research is both a noun and a verb, right? So we talk about research as if a body of research. So, it's like, well, we want our science, we want our policies to be research-based, right? So what they're saying is that they want things to be done where they look at the body of research and they identify kind of what the best practice is based upon the body of research. Research is also a verb in the sense that it's a process, so that there's what defines kind of the way that research is done versus what, say, journalism is done, is that research is supposed to follow a scientific process, and that scientific process is set up purposely to be very, very tough to come to conclusions. That is just to prove something. So the whole way that the scientific process is based is that you have a research question, and then you set up a very, very tough test. And then you go through and you see whether or not the data, based on the data, you can basically, there's evidence that your kind of hypothesis is correct. And then from that, then you can make a statement. But you can't sort of come through and say that you've proven anything in research. All you can say is that the data are consistent with my hypothesis. As opposed to journalism, not to knock journalism, but journalism is something to which, you're telling a story, basically. And yes, you're reporting the facts, but you're doing it in a way that you're trying to put them together in a coherent story. And so journalism does not necessarily follow a research process. But it's what makes research kind of special in terms of as the thing that people always say, well, we need it to be research-based and science-based, is because of the process that you follow. Okay, so what's the steps to follow in a research process? Well, we're going to go through those basically as we go through today. But the other thing about it is that there has to be ethics and the principles by which you go through and that you adhere to that scientific method, because you can adhere to the scientific method and do unethical research. So you probably heard about the Tuskegee step experiment. Right? That's something for which public health was doing a research process, a scientific process, in that they picked one group of African American men and they treated them for syphilis, and they picked another group of African American men and they didn't treat them for syphilis and didn't let them know they had syphilis, to sort of see what would happen. So that they followed the research process, but it was an unethical process to follow. This is if you watch Oppenheimer, I've read the book, so this is what he went through, is it ethical to go through and to create a bomb that can kill 200,000 people? Is that, you can go through the research process to do it, and there's nothing in the research process that tells you that is somehow not something that you should do. So that's where ethics comes into research. And despite what some people like to say, there is no unbiased research, because everything that you do as a researcher, you do it through your own kind of lens of the world. And so that means that there's not like a research process where you're discovering the unvarnished truth. Instead, what there is that you come up as a person, you come up with what, you have your views of the world, and then you test those views of the world. And so it means that, views of world change over time, and that views of world can be, subject to different type of ethical strengths as we go through, and ethics can change. And the last thing then is that we're going to talk about dissemination and implementation. So, if you had taken this course 20 years ago, they wouldn't talk about dissemination and implementation. The assumption was that for research, that the dissemination process was that you publish it in peer-reviewed journals. And what's happened in the last 20 years is that there's been much more recognition that research needs to be have some impact on people's lives. And so they've started to, the federal government mainly has gone through and started to push that research becomes much more of that you place a lot more emphasis on what happens to your research when you're done. So the normal way that we do research now, especially in public health, is that you do it with community members, right? You have community-based research, whatever the community is that you're working with, but you do it with the groups that are going to be impacted by that. And partly because there's this, it's just better science to do it that way, but also because there's this idea that the research needs to be appropriate for people, and it also needs to be used by people when they're done with it. So it's this dissemination process that then kind of comes through and starts to become more formally like a part of the research process than it used to be. Okay, so your book is going to show you, and you'll see these all over the place, the sort of the research, kind of the process by which you do research. So formulate a hypothesis, you review the literature, you then kind of, come up with, clarify your hypothesis. So, your hypothesis, when it says formulate a hypothesis, it could be like, Rudy saying, I think that people are going to use cannabis for pain. Older people are going to use cannabis for pain control, right? That's your thought. And then what you do is you go look at the literature and you see what the literature says. And that then based upon that, you'll find studies where it either shows that, people have well researched this, or that they haven't well researched this, and then from that, then, you kind of refine. And this is sort of an iterative process where you go back and forth. And at some point, then you come up with sort of a question that you want to have answered, a research question. And so at that point, then you do what's called operationalize your variables. So that's where, like for Rudy, you're interested in looking at older people's use of marijuana for pain management, right? So then operationalize variable means, okay, how do you identify marijuana use? Like, how would you measure whether someone's using marijuana? Yeah, so like in a survey, or let's say if you were going to go out there in the public and measure marijuana use, how would you do it?
Survey, what they based on the data they were running before the election, know what circumstances would use it.
Yeah, so you could do it. You could ask people. You could say, have you ever used marijuana for pain management? And then if so, how much did you use and things like that. So that's one way to do it. What's another way you could do it? Figure out whether people are using marijuana for pain management. Well, you could, take blood samples, right? To see whether or not you can measure, identify how much pain, go to a pain point, see how much, for people who are in pain, and then go through and get a blood sample and check to see whether or not there's, traces of THC in their blood that would suggest they use marijuana. It's another way. You could give people marijuana, right? You could sort of say, for this group of people over here, we're going to give you marijuana. For this people over here, we're going to give you, a placebo. And then we're going to go through and sort of see how much people in both groups use this for pain management. So there's different ways you could do it. That's what operationalize means. Operationalize means, how do you go from this concept, like, I want to measure people's pain, I think that people in pain are going to use marijuana, to actually go through it and what exactly you can measure. That's what operationalize kind of means, is to go from that process. And then you go through and you figure out, all right, how am I going to collect the data? So am I going to do a survey? Am I going to go out there and do blood samples, what it's going to be? You then collect your data, you then analyze it, and then you go through and that you kind of draw conclusions. Does it look like it? Can we conclude that people who are older people who are in pain use marijuana? Oftentimes you'll see this like as a more of a circle, because in reality, the way it works is that, let's say if Rudy was to do this and go out there and to measure this and to do a survey, find out the association between pain management and willingness to use marijuana, and then go through, does his results, he's likely to come up with other questions after that. And so therefore, what that does is that leads into his next study. And so the research process then is this process of you do something, you test it, and then you reassess. And then you do something, test it, and reassess. So that's why it's often seen more as not as a linear process, but more of a circle. And the idea is that in the middle of all this is theory, because the theory is the thing that helps guide your choice of what you're going to look at. So, like in Rudy's case, what's the theory behind thinking that there might be association between marijuana and pain management? Well, people in pain don't want to be in pain, right? And so therefore they're going to look for things that are going to get them to stop having the pain. And so therefore they might use marijuana. So that's the logic, right? That's a behavioral theory. It's not a controversial one. I think that no one's going to sit there and say, well, wait a minute, prove that people in pain want relief from pain, because I think everyone's going to accept that. But what it does do is it gives you, that's the kind of linkage that you're kind of using. And when you make that linkage, then what it does is you can start to identify, well, where is it that this might break down? So for example, people in pain might want to get relief from pain. That seems like it's fairly clear. Is there anyone who is in pain who doesn't want relief from pain? Well, maybe people are worried about side effects, right? I mean, if what you are is that you're in something and the only thing that works is opium, is that opioids, that you might sort of think, ooh, I don't know if it's worth it for me to take opioids and risk getting addicted for pain management. So there is kind of a lot of what's the case where people are often in pain and don't want pain management? That's a common thing that happens, especially it's only to women, that they're in pain and they don't necessarily want pain management. Yeah, having birth, right? Is that when when you have birth, is that they say, do you want to have pain medication? And most women will, not most, but a lot of women on their first child will say no until they're in labor, and then they might say yes at that point. But that's something for which you could know you're going to be in pain, and you'd still say I don't want pain management at that case. So there are cases where it may break down, so that you got that link then. And then why is it that going from the link of wanting pain management to use marijuana? I mean, show of hands. If you were in pain, let's say if you have lower back pain, how many people here would use marijuana for lower back pain? How many people wouldn't use it for lower back pain? Okay, for those who wouldn't, why wouldn't you use marijuana for lower back pain?
Because I think we're so used to, well, me personally, I'm so used to thinking, oh, marijuana is not the best way to go on other medication that can help alleviate pain. So yeah,
Yeah, so you think that there might be, I mean, I think that's a view that I think Rudy will find out, but I think among older people especially, like if I think about marijuana, I think about getting high off marijuana. And I think, well, I don't know if I really want that to get high, to get rid of my back pain. But the alternative would be is that, well, it's not, you don't have to get high, but you could just use THC oil, whatever it's going to be. So there are alternatives, but it's like people may have these notions that they don't want to go for that. Same with opioids, right? Like if you said, if you're in lower back pain and the doctor said, oh, here's some opioids, right? How many people would take them? Well, I think 15 years ago, people took a lot of it because of it. And nowadays, I think people, well, the doctors wouldn't offer it to you. But even if they did, I think a lot of people now would probably say, no, I don't think so. So it's like people's perceptions then are going to determine, whether they're going to, use it or not. And then the other thing is just availability, is how much that you can actually go out and get it. So there's a number of different steps along the way from being in pain to actually using some type of marijuana for pain management, right? So that's what we're doing as we're talking about this is thinking essentially about what the theory is that you're thinking about the causal link between going from here to there and what can happen in between. And this what can happen in between thing, we're just sort of coming up off of our heads in terms of things that might interrupt it. But there turns out that there's lots of theories, psychological theories about why people seek different types of care behavior that you could use. So if you went over to the psychology department and you looked at the theory of planned behavior, right? The theory of planned behavior would have would sort of say, oh, this is the process that people go through from going from this stage to actually using something. So point being is that usually, you always have some type of implicit theory that's going on. And one of the things about research is to try and be very explicit about what your theory is and to know how you're going to go out there and, which theory you're going to use. All right, so why do people do research? Well, there's different kind of categories of research. So one is just the researcher generated. So really is researcher generated research, right? Topic here, why did you choose this topic?
Because kind of pretty much new market. So, and there's a lot of studies out there that have actually emphasized the wrong cannabis. And I think it's good based on Grand Valley.
And why in the valley?
Because there's a lack of overall, there's a lack of research in the valley. And most of the studies that have looked into cannabis, that they have focused on urban areas, LA and stuff. But this area is gonna really rise.
Right. Did anyone pay you to do this research? Did someone pay you to do this research?
No, but I'm hoping we'll pay off
That's right.
after.
Do you want me to put the GoFundMe link up there right now? Is it too soon? Too soon. Yeah, we'll wait a little bit. So, but so this is your idea that was generated. So that's one way of getting kind of research, how research can come about, is that the researcher has the idea, the researcher then goes through it and does the research. A second way is that since the same thing, but basically is that you apply to a granting agency like the NIH or the NCI or someone like that for funding. And the way that these research projects work is that a researcher like Rudy would have an idea. He would put down his idea into a grant proposal, sends off the grant proposal off to NIH or NCI, probably National Cancer Institute. Well, no, probably. What agency would be right for this?
Well, TRDRP study cannabis in there as well.
Okay, TRDRP. So that's the tobacco research. It's basically the state gets money from tobacco settlement, and it gets administered as research funds. So people can apply for research funds from this TRDRP, which is the tobacco money that's used for research. And the way it works is that Rudy would put in an application, says this is what I want to do. He would then send it off. They'd have a team then, like a group of experts that would review it. Often you don't get funded on your first one, but what they do is that they would come back with sort of a scoring. They actually score the research, and and they give them comments. And so then Rudy would then probably revise it and send it back in, and then based upon that, then get funding for it. So Rudy, it's still Rudy's research. He's still doing the same type of thing, but what it says is it's gone through this kind of peer review kind of process. That's a research funding from a grant. The third type is research that's commissioned. And so this is type of research whereby some agency says, we want a certain type of research that's done, And then they go out there and they find researchers, you basically apply to do that. So this is a lot of public health research goes into this category, especially evaluation type work. So somebody will say, the state will say, well, I was involved with one in Merced Public Health Department. They got money to basically do a diabetes prevention program. And so, so the university, then we got money to basically do the evaluation for them. So what they were doing is that they were doing this evaluation, this big diabetes prevention program, and that, we came through and that we then, helped them identify what kind of information to collect. We, went out there and collected some information. We then went through and kind of put it together and gave them a report. So that was an evaluation type project. That's a third type, in that they want something specifically done. They want an evaluation of their project. And so what we were doing as the university is basically coming in and doing that for them. So we couldn't have come through and said, thanks for the money. We're going to do money on cannabis research instead to see what people think for pain medication. They would have said, no, that's not what this money's for. The project you're working on, right, is funded by the California Department of Public Health. And that CDPH came through and they said, they want to know specifically kind of how to improve their decision making. So it's a contract that at the end of it, we have to develop training programs for them in certain areas. So we've got some leeway in there and that we can do research along the way, but ultimately that's what this grant is about. This contract's about. It's about developing training programs for local and state public health people. So that's a contract type of work. So when you get out there and work in public health departments, well, which of these three? If you went and worked for Merced Public Health Department, which of these three would you likely be doing the most? Three, right? You'd be doing three. Because the way that most funding works now within public health is that public health gets money from the state or from the CDC to do specific projects. So if you're in a public health department, you have to write grants, right? You write grants. The CDC will come through and say, we want to do, education programs for cannabis education programs to try and get kids to stop doing cannabis. And they would say, we want these types of things done specifically. And then, Merced would write a grant. And Merced would write a grant that says, okay, this is what we'll do. We'll kind of do these type of activities, et cetera. And they'd send it to the CDC. And the CDC then would probably say, okay, fine, that's a good way to do it. Or they may come back and say, well, do it this way or whatever. And so there may be some back and forth. But at the end of it, they get a grant. They get from the CDC to basically do this type of education program. And so then Merced Public Health then has to do it, right? They have to do the education program. Oftentimes within that education program, they also will say you have to do an evaluation of it. So you have to include some type of measures to tell us whether you're successful in terms of this. So that's the third type of research. And that's really what mostly, what most people do when they get into public health departments, is that they end up doing that type of work where it's writing grants and getting them money from an agency and then doing specific things with that and then reporting back kind of how they did. Questions? It's all the same though, in terms of the principles. It's all the same. So even though we're talking about different types of research, is that the skills that you learn to do the first one is exactly the same as the skills you need to do the third one. There's some different emphasis. Like for the third one, you probably end up doing a lot more evaluation work, but all evaluation work is just research in an applied setting. That's all it is. So, all right, and then dissemination and implementation, we'll talk about that as we go through. But just to make clear is that, if you look at this list here, right, no real dissemination and implementation. So it though is now seen as like a key thing that we're going to do. And that in doing this, we're going to talk about how to do team research, how to do community-based research, how to do different types of multi-disciplinary type of research, etc. Okay. I know you'd be interested in my research experience. So my first research experience was when I was an undergraduate. at UCSB, and I was a psychology major. I came as a psychology major, so I really wanted to be a psychologist. And so I went and I was taking that class in social psychology and went to go volunteer for a professor there who was doing experiments on children, like doing these. What he was doing is he was doing these experiments where he's very famous for it in psychology. For doing these things where he looked at whether people would choose fair allocations or equitable allocations when they're dividing up resources. And the idea is that, let's say if you and I are doing some type of task, and you do 8 of these, whatever, you produce 8, I produce 4, and then they give you $100 and say, now split the money between the 2 of us, and you can do it any way you want. The question is, does she say, well, I'm going to do it based upon 50-50, so I'll get $50 and you get $50? Or does she say, well, wait a minute, I get twice as much as this guy did, so I'm going to get $67 and he gets $33. So which one do you think she does? Actually, it depends. Depends on whether I know what she's doing. If I'm blind to it, then she's much more likely to choose an equitable. Because she'd say, well, this was the task, and so therefore. On the other hand, if we're sitting there looking at each other, then she might be more likely to go through and say, oh, well, let's just do it equally, right? So what this was about was this was a study where this Linda Kyle was his graduate student, and she was doing this with children, and so and this was before they had internet connections to LA, and we're sitting in Santa Barbara. So what I had to do is I had to ride my bike down to the school, and at the end, outside the school in the ground, she'd have this little trailer, and that you bring a kid in, and I was the person who was supposed to administer this, and I would explain that we were going to be doing a bead sorting task, and we're going to be doing it on a video link with another kid who's in Los Angeles. And so what we do is that we would then go through and that do this task, and then we'd get together, and at the end of it, then we'd be done. And so then I turn on the little video. I say, okay, we're going to do the live screen now. I turn on the video, and then it would just sort of, come in, and that the person was on tape. And so it'd be this woman and another child sitting on tape. And then I had a script I knew I had to say, like, oh, hi. And they'd say, hi. And we'd go back and forth like this for a while. And then we'd say, okay, we're going to do the task now. And then we're going to put it on pause. And then I'd have the person you're the child now. I'd have the child go through and do the beads on task. And then I had different conditions. Thank you. I had different conditions. And one condition is that you did 8 of them. Another condition, you only did 4. And then I would stop it. And then I would stop whenever you got to what it was. And we would go back on. And then the other kid either did more than you or less than you. And then we'd say, okay, bye. And then I'd say to you, oh, now we got money for you to split. And so what she was looking at is like whether there was developmentally across time, whether kids used different types of fairness rules. And so, what she found was basically is that, yes, kids use different type of fairness rules as they go through. When they're younger, they tend to use more, just I want it all, right? And when they're older, then they start to use more like, 50-50 type things. So I was not a co-author. You notice that she's the only co-author on this. So she's the only author, I should say. In fact, her advisor wasn't even an author on this one, which is nowadays that really wouldn't be done. It's like when Rudy publishes his stuff, I'll be the first author on everything. Isn't that right, Rudy? That's exactly right. No, but nowadays is that you definitely would put your author, your advisor on things like this. But back then, people didn't really do it. So she published it. I was mentioned in a footnote. So if you go look at this paper, you'll see down there it says it thanks me in a little acknowledgement at the bottom. The first paper I ever published was actually after graduate school. So I went to graduate school in Wisconsin in economics. Because by that point, also when I was an undergraduate, doing this study actually is I met my wife, who was a psychology major, who's a professor of psychology in the county. And so we met basically at this study. And she is, I realized when I met her is that, oh, that's what a real psychologist looks like. And I realized that I wasn't really a psychologist. And I was also taking economics classes at the time. So economics was so I went to economics. And then I went to graduate school in economics. And in my PhD, the way that the PhD program, there's different types of PhD programs. So some types of PhD programs are what you might call mentorship programs, where you enter into a program and that you then go through and that you work with your professor. So this one, like when Rudy applied, he applied to come and work with me, right? And so, you know, I gladly agreed to have Rudy come be a PhD student. And so he's been a PhD student. Rudy could change advisors. So if, you know, if he got upset with me for something, he could go, or just his interests started to change, he could go change advisors if he wanted to. But for the most part, it's a mentorship program. The other type of program is what you would call the salmon swimming upstream program. And this is like, University of Chicago does this, where they'll bring in 100 new PhD students. And out of that 100 new PhD students, maybe 20 of them will be accepted to the second year. And so what happens then is that all these students kind of go through and that they're all trying to be one of those 20 who make the second year. And at Chicago, you can go through and you can do the first year again and again. So sometimes you may have students that are 3 years just doing the first year in order to try and get into the second year program. So that's a very cutthroat. That's the salmon swimming upstream type of model, where you bring in a whole bunch, but they're all going to die off along the way. In public health, well, which one do you think is mostly in public health? Do you think it's mostly like what UC Merced basically has, where it's more of a mentorship program? Or do you think it's more the salmon swimming upstream program? Well, it's more kind of it's closer to the salmon swimming upstream program. And that what most places will do, like I taught at North Carolina. In North Carolina, big public health department. What they do is that they would bring in a whole bunch of students for the MPH. And that then, after you're done with the MPH your last year, that's when you apply for the PhD program. And not everyone's going to be made in the PhD program. But you have to do your MPH for the most part at UNC in order to go into the PhD program. So it meant that, there's a lot of students in the MPH program, and only a few of them were going to get into that PhD program. And I didn't realize this, going through it. And I was really amazed when, in that come about January, I was starting to get all these messages from students saying how interested they were in my work and everything. I thought, oh, finally, I'm being recognized. And then I realized that no, they're not really interested in my work. What they were doing is that they were just looking for an advisor to basically agree to work with them moving forward. And I was an advisor. So that's the way a lot of MPH programs are. So it means that if you want to do a PhD, and if you think you may want to do a PhD in public health, probably pick the school to do your MPH where you want to do your PhD. Because sometimes what will happen, and it happens here too, is that people who do an MPH other places, when they come here, they basically just make them start from scratch, even though you've done an MPH other places. So it really helps to go and do your MPH or where you're going to do your PhD from. Anyways, this was a research that I did as part of my PhD. And then I got my PhD in 1990. And then it took 5 years to get published. Was that a long time to get published? Well, not back then. Back then, you'd send away an article, and that the article would probably take 6 months, 8 months before you get any reviews back. And then you have to review it, send it in, takes another 6 or 8 months. So it'd be like a 2-year process from the time that you sent in an article to the time that it actually got published. And that if you got rejected then, which is not very, which is not uncommon, if you got rejected when you sent your article in initially, then what would happen is that you have to send it someplace else. So there'd be another 6 months waiting for the response. In health, it tends to be now much faster than that. So in health now, that typically they want, the journals will say, we want a review of the journal within 21 days. And after 21 days, then they just write you and say, never mind, we don't need it anymore. So health, they've really sped this up. Why do you think that they've sped up the process of getting reviews done? There's so many journals now are you have to pay for them. And so they don't want to screw around with, with these long processes. And so if you go for one of the journals, that's where you submit an article and you have to pay to get it published, is that then they'll do it pretty fast. Do you know about the difference between open access and closed access journals? Show me yes, I know the difference between no, I don't know the difference. Okay, well, we'll talk about open versus closed access journals. That was my first paper. I know you all want to go read it. So I then went into health. So when I got a job in the medical school, never done health before. So this is my first paper. I think this is my first paper I did in health. And when I started working in medical school, I suddenly found is that I had all these doctors coming and want to do research with me. And again, I thought, oh, they finally realized my brilliance. But then I realized that no, it's because in medicine, especially this was down in New Zealand, in medicine, is that oftentimes they have to do cost effectiveness studies. So when they get money from the grant, as part of the grant, they have to say that we're going to do a cost effectiveness study for whatever the intervention is. And so they write in that they're going to do a cost effectiveness study, but they're on their health economics grant. So I did a lot of studies of this cost effectiveness type, whereby they would come through and that they would help me go through and do the cost effectiveness one. This one was on preoperative gonadotropin releasing analogs for women with uveoid fibroid. I obviously didn't do a lot in terms of the medical side of this. All I did is I talked to them before and said, we'll collect this type of outcome information, collect this type of cost information, then I help them put together this. So you'll notice also is that this is the abstract. You notice the abstract is that it has objective, design, setting, sample, methods, main outcome, results and conclusions. This is also the typical type of abstract that you can see in medical, in the papers that we read in public health and medicine, is that they're very organized like this. And they're very organized like this primarily because they're speaking to a medical community, and the assumption is, probably rightly, is that doctors are not going to want to sit there and read through this type of thing. Instead, what they're going to want to do is basically see it so they can just quickly say, okay, what were they doing? What did they do? What did they find? And so this is a type of abstract, and it's called structured abstract, where they do it in the different categories. And it's because it's just easier for people just to go right to the section they want to look at. This is one that, the first one I was the first author of, and we'll talk about authorship, what that means. Here's another one that was just recently published. This was on measuring stroke and transient TIA burdens in New Zealand, protocol for the 5th Auckland Regional Community Stroke Study. So I've been involved in the Auckland Regional Community Stroke Study for 20 years. We've done these different type of population-based studies down there. And I was sort of the health economist. This got published in the International Journal of Stroke. Those are the authors. There's my name. My name's in there someplace. Notice a lot of different authors. So this is also something that happens a lot in medicine and public health, especially medicine, is you end up with a ton of different authors. So we'll talk about why that is. More recently, just did the farm worker health study. So this is this was a project that was funded by the California Department of Public Health. Right? They came and they came and essentially wanted me to put together a study that would survey farm workers. So I worked with Ed Padilla and Ed Flores and Anna Padilla in sociology in the Community Labor Center. And we, during the middle of the pandemic, we interviewed 1,500 farm workers from around the country. So notice that this one is 110 pages, this report, and that this is not even the data files. The data files are another 100 pages after that. So that's what, this is commission type of work that goes along the, we were basically, we were commissioned to do this by CDPH. But at the same time, then they left it kind of open to us, in terms of how we want to do it. But what we had to do is we had to meet with them every month. Every month we'd meet with them, tell them, go through the methodology, tell them what we're doing. We had to form an advisory group of we had a couple different advisory groups. We had one advisory group of community members who work with farm workers. We had another advisory group of kind of growers and other people like that. So it was a very elaborate study. The first paper that came out was this one. Nimrat Sandhu is a PhD student in public health. And so, she published this. In fact, she won an award for it at the American Journal of Public Health Association for the work. So if you think about, if you look at these ones, right? This paper here, very theoretical. It was basically a randomized control trial that was, that was testing a specific theory about how people learn. So this one here, very descriptive. Says that, people are writing papers based upon it, but for the most part, it's a descriptive study. And for research then, you'll see is that when you develop a research question, it's going to be one of those two different types of motivations. So you're either going to have theory that you're going to use for something, or you're going to, if you just do a descriptive study, you can do a descriptive study, but it's got to be something that's new. So for example, a simple descriptive study about people use marijuana for pain management probably is not going to be enough to be of interest. It's got to be more detailed and more specific than that. On the other hand, a descriptive study about farm worker health is something that's pretty interesting because there's just not that much data on farm worker health. So as we start talking about research questions, which is assignment 2 for you, talking about research questions, just be aware is that one of the key things I'm going to ask you is that, is this a descriptive study or is it a theoretical based study? And if it's a descriptive study, then you're going to have to tell me why it's really interesting, why it's, it's something that we don't know much about. Where the theory study means that you're going to be based upon something that, some type of idea that you have about what's going on in the background. It also means is that you should ask yourself, what is your theory? What are you trying to do? So if you're in psychology, then usually psychology has very, very specific theories about behavior change that they use. On the other hand, public health doesn't really. In public health, you could try and use the ecological model and things like that, but oftentimes public health doesn't really have theories that they use. A lot of what public health does is descriptive. In fact, if you look at, I'm not sure if you've ever seen this, but this is what's called the policy cycle, where basically, there's determinants of health and from that you identify needs, and then your health services kind of offer services to address those needs, and that you then have unmet needs, and that then the policy, there's some type of policy response, and you get intervention, etc. If you go and you look at, well, what is public health going to do, right? Well, epidemiology is really about determinants of health, about just, reporting rates of cancer or rates of this or rates of that. I mean, that's really what epidemiology is, a descriptive type of study. Evaluation services are kind of descriptive studies as well, because evaluation services, often what you're doing is that you're just reporting and you're seeing whether something worked or not. When you get up here to developing interventions, developing new types of programs, like that's where you tend to get more into theory up in those type of areas. So we'll talk about this later as we go on, but just wanted to let you start thinking about it. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to focus on understanding kind of how research is done, understanding some of the professional conduct, and then how we work with groups and disseminate the information. Read the book, read the articles. It's such a good classroom, as I said, because you can't hide, so I can ask you questions and expect answers. So read the articles before you come to class. Anything else? Any questions? No, don't take attendance, no. Other questions? You asked because you want everyone to be here, and so you just want to make sure that, no, I get it, yeah. You can take attendance, we'll nominate you the attendance taker. All right, yeah, say it again. Oh, okay, I'll go and unlock it. And also, I'll put the lecture notes on there. Yeah, I'll post them on there. So what I'll do is on CAT courses, I'll put a module where I put the lecture notes for that lecture.